I didn't build my life to end up here, questioning the loyalty of the woman I had spent 2 decades calling my wife. Amanda and I had shared years of building a family, a home, and what I believed was an unshakable partnership. But the signs were impossible to ignore. It started with the small things. Her phone was always in her hand or tucked into her bag, even at home, a habit she never had before. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter, screen facing up, without a second thought. Then there were her sudden late evenings at work, the vague explanations about meetings running long, and her growing preoccupation with her appearance. At first, I brushed it off. Amanda was an attractive woman, and I understood that she might feel the need to keep up appearances. But men who succeed don't ignore patterns. The pieces started fitting together like a puzzle, and the picture they revealed wasn't pretty. The moment that pushed me from suspicion to certainty came on an otherwise ordinary evening. Amanda had gone to take a shower, leaving her phone on the counter for once. It buzzed. A single notification lit up the screen, and curiosity got the better of me. The message was from someone named Rick. It read, "I can't wait to see you tonight." Same place? I didn't touch the phone. I didn't shout or storm into the bathroom demanding answers. A man who reacts impulsively loses control. Instead, I let the moment settle in my mind, noting every detail. Amanda's carelessness told me this wasn't the first time. That night, I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. It wasn't enough to see one message and jump to conclusions. I needed to be sure. The next day, I checked our shared credit card account. That's when I found the charges at dinners at upscale restaurants I'd never heard of and hotel stays in our own city. She wasn't even trying to cover her tracks. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I started planning. That's what a man does when he's been disrespected, he regains control. I took note of everything, every unexplained absence, every transaction, every lie. Over the next week, I installed a GPS tracker on her car and a hidden camera in our living room. If she wanted to play me for a fool, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. As the pieces came together, I realized the depth of her betrayal wasn't just about one man. It was about the choices I had made that allowed this to happen. I had given Amanda too much freedom, too much trust. Stability had become boring to her. She had chosen chaos, and chaos always leads to destruction. This wasn't just about Amanda and Rick. This was about respect, something no man should ever lose in his own home. By the end of the week, I had all the evidence I needed. What came next wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. By the time Amanda left the house the next evening, I was fully prepared to track her every move. Over the past several days, I had meticulously pieced together a trail of inconsistencies that painted a damning picture of deceit. I wasn't about to confront her without concrete proof that couldn't be explained away or twisted into something innocent. When she kissed me goodbye and casually mentioned meeting her friends for dinner, I nodded and gave her the same trusting smile I'd perfected over the years. She walked out the door, fully believing I had no idea what she was doing. As soon as her car turned the corner, I grabbed my phone and opened the GPS tracking app. I'd placed a small tracker under her car last week, and now every turn, stop, and detour she made would be sent directly to my screen. Instead of heading toward the restaurant she claimed to frequent, Amanda drove across town and stopped at a high-end hotel. Not the kind of cheap place people use to avoid prying eyes, but a luxurious establishment designed to impress. I parked a few blocks away and watched from a distance. Within minutes, Amanda appeared at the entrance. She wasn't alone. A man stood waiting for her, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. He greeted her with a casual smile, and the way they interacted left no room for doubt. There was a familiarity between them that couldn't be mistaken. I stayed in my car, camera in hand, and captured several photos of them together. They didn't kiss or touch, but their body language said everything I needed to know. After a brief exchange, they walked inside. I didn't follow. It wasn't the right moment. Instead, I reviewed the footage later that night from the hidden cameras I'd installed at home. The devices hadn't yet captured anything suspicious, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Around midnight, when Amanda was asleep, I took her phone. She had become overly protective of it recently, always keeping it close, but carelessness comes with routine. It wasn't hard to access, and within minutes, I found what I was looking for, a string of messages between her and Rick. Their conversations were cloaked in a thin layer of plausible deniability, no explicit language, no direct admissions, but the meaning was clear. Phrases like "I can't wait for our next meeting" and "last time was amazing" told me everything I needed to know. She had even sent him photos of herself. They weren't indecent, but they weren't the kind of pictures she ever sent me. She wore outfits I'd never seen her wear around the house, and her expressions in the photos were ones of excitement and desire. I took screenshots of every message and every photo, cataloging each one with timestamps and dates. I matched her hotel visits to charges on our shared credit card, creating a timeline that was impossible to refute. But my anger didn't overwhelm me. This wasn't the time to lose focus or act out of emotion. Men who lash out in moments of betrayal often find themselves losing control, and I wasn't going to be one of them. Instead, I used the information I'd gathered to begin building the framework for what was to come. Amanda's actions weren't just a betrayal of me, they were a betrayal of the trust one had built over 2 decades. And that trust wasn't something she would take away from me without consequences. Rick wasn't going to escape this unscathed, either. I tracked down his full name, his workplace, and even his social media accounts. It wasn't difficult. People who think they're invincible tend to leave traces of their lives everywhere. By morning, I had enough information on him to know exactly how to dismantle his life, one piece at a time. As I sat at the dinner table the next evening, watching Amanda laugh as if nothing had changed, I felt no need to rush. She had no idea that her betrayal was now catalogued in meticulous detail, or that I was already orchestrating the downfall of both her and her lover. She smiled at me, oblivious to the storm that was about to engulf her. Amanda had no idea how thoroughly her world was unraveling. She was still acting like nothing had changed, maintaining her facade of innocence and trust. But every laugh, every casual excuse, every word she spoke only confirmed how little respect she had left for me. The evidence I had already gathered was damning, but it wasn't enough. Not for what I had in mind. I wasn't going to settle for a simple confrontation or an emotional breakdown. Amanda and Rick had made choices, and those choices were about to cost them dearly. The first phase of my plan was financial. Amanda had grown accustomed to the life I provided, joint accounts, credit cards, and all the comforts of stability. It was time to take those away. Over the course of a week, I opened a private account and began moving money into it. Small amounts at first, then larger transfers, all under the guise of routine financial management. At the same time, I flagged our shared credit cards for unusual activity and had her access restricted. When Amanda tried to use her card at one of her favorite boutiques, the transaction was declined. She came home that evening, annoyed but trying to play it off. "I think the bank messed up something with the card," she said, dropping the bag she hadn't been able to pay for on the table. I nodded, hiding my satisfaction. "I'll call them tomorrow," I replied, knowing full well there wouldn't be anything to fix. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring her every move. The GPS tracker on her car showed her going back to the same hotel where she'd met Rick before. This time, they didn't linger in the lobby. Instead, they headed straight for the elevator. I stayed in my car, snapping photos of them walking together. The way she laughed at something he said, the way he leaned in slightly as they talked, it all made my stomach churn, but I kept my focus. When she returned home that night, she barely made an effort to come up with a story. "Work ran late again," she said, heading straight to the shower. I didn't bother asking questions. Instead, I accessed her phone again after she fell asleep. This time, their messages were even bolder. Rick was openly planning a weekend away with her, talking about flights and hotel reservations. She responded enthusiastically, discussing what she'd pack and how free she felt when they were together. Free. That word stuck with me. Amanda felt free with him because she thought I was the weight holding her down. She had no idea that the stability she took for granted was the only thing keeping her afloat. The next day, I made my first move against Rick. Through my research, I discovered that he was married to a woman named Danielle, a teacher at a local elementary school. She seemed like the kind of person who believed in the best in people, a stark contrast to the man she was married to. I drafted an anonymous letter to Danielle, including the photos of Rick and Amanda entering the hotel and screenshots of their messages. I didn't send it immediately, timing was everything, and I wanted to ensure it would cause maximum damage when it landed. My next step was more direct. I called Rick's workplace, posing as a potential client interested in his services. His receptionist eagerly scheduled a meeting, not knowing the true purpose of my visit. When I walked into his office, Rick greeted me with a polished smile, completely unaware of who I was. I shook his hand, noting the slight arrogance in his posture. He clearly thought he was untouchable. The meeting itself was a formality. I steered the conversation toward his personal life, watching for any signs of guilt or hesitation. Instead, Rick bragged about his adventurous weekends and hinted at relationships that didn't involve his wife. His confidence was infuriating, but I kept my composure. By the time I left, I had everything I needed to destroy him. Rick wasn't just a cheater, and he was careless, and his recklessness would be his downfall. That evening, as Amanda sat across from me at the dinner table, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. She smiled, laughed, and acted as if everything was normal, completely unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. I didn't rush. This wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about precision, about ensuring that when the final blow landed, there would be no recovery for either of them. Amanda's confidence was staggering. She thought she had me fooled, walking around the house as if her secret life with Rick didn't exist. But ignorance breeds carelessness, and carelessness was all I needed to bring everything crashing down. The more evidence I collected, the clearer her pattern became. She wasn't just cheating, she was creating an entirely new life for herself, a life where I was nothing but a convenient provider. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite my story. She had no idea that every step she took brought her closer to the trap I was building. Rick was my next target. His smugness during our fake meeting was burned into my memory. A man like him didn't deserve the quiet life he enjoyed, shielded by the naivety of his wife, Danielle. I had already drafted the email to her but decided I needed more. Rick wasn't just a cheater, he was reckless, and I planned to exploit that to its fullest extent. Through some research, I uncovered more about Rick's work life. He had a history of questionable business practices, cutting corners, using company funds for personal expenses, and covering it up with doctored paperwork. It was sloppy, but it was enough to give me leverage. I made an anonymous call to his company's HR department. I told them I had information regarding potential embezzlement and promised to send them documents that would raise serious questions about Rick's ethics. I wasn't bluffing, I had enough evidence to plant seeds of doubt, and corporate environments thrive on suspicion. Meanwhile, Amanda continued her routine. She was still texting Rick, planning their weekend getaway as if I didn't exist. The nerve of it all only fueled my determination. She didn't just betray me, she disrespected everything I had built for us. I knew the weekend trip was my opportunity to strike. They had planned to meet at a lake house a few hours away, rented under Rick's name. Amanda lied effortlessly, telling me she was heading out of town for a yoga retreat. I pretended to believe her, even helping her pack the car. Once she left, I followed her at a safe distance, using the GPS tracker to keep her in view. The lake house was secluded, surrounded by trees and far from prying eyes. It was perfect, not for them, but for me. After they settled in, I parked nearby and watched. They were relaxed, laughing on the deck as if their world was untouchable. Little did they know, I was about to shatter it. Using the high-resolution camera I had brought, I captured every moment, Amanda leaning into Rick, holding his hand, and sharing stolen glances that were anything but innocent. They moved inside, and I waited, biding my time. My goal wasn't just to confront them, it was to expose them. As they enjoyed their getaway, I sent the email to Danielle. It included photos of Rick and Amanda together, screenshots of their messages, and a detailed timeline of their affair. I also added a note: "Your husband and my wife are spending the weekend at this address. You deserve to know the truth." The response was swift. Danielle called me within the hour, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and devastation. I told her everything I knew, answering her questions with the calm precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. By the end of the call, she was on her way to the lake house, determined to confront Rick herself. But I wasn't done. I sent an anonymous tip to the local police, alerting them to suspicious activity at the property. I knew Rick had brought alcohol, and Amanda had a tendency to leave things out in the open. A staged visit from the authorities would only add to their chaos. When the police arrived, the scene unfolded exactly as I had hoped. Danielle showed up shortly after, storming into the house with righteous fury. The shouting that followed was audible even from where I sat in my car, documenting every second. Amanda and Rick's perfect weekend had turned into a spectacle. Danielle's confrontation left Rick scrambling for excuses, while Amanda tried, and failed, to maintain her composure. The police added another layer of humiliation, questioning them about the alcohol and suspicious behavior. By the time it was over, Rick's marriage was in shambles, and Amanda's mask of control had completely slipped. But this was only the beginning. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. The trap had worked perfectly, but the real reckoning was still to come. Amanda didn't come home the night after her disastrous weekend getaway. I wasn't surprised. The humiliation she endured at the lake house, courtesy of Danielle and the police, had left her reeling. She was probably with Rick, scrambling to pick up the pieces of their shattered delusion. But I wasn't done yet. The destruction of their little fantasy was only the beginning. The next morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. I made coffee, read the news, and waited. Around noon, Amanda walked in, her face pale and her usual confidence nowhere to be found. She muttered something about staying with a friend and headed straight for the shower. Her disheveled appearance only confirmed what I already knew: she was unraveling. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I went to my office, locked the door, and began working on the next phase of my plan. Rick was going to regret ever crossing my path. Through my research, I discovered that Rick's marketing firm had a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Armed with the information I'd gathered, I crafted an anonymous report detailing his affair with Amanda and included proof of his questionable expenses charged to company accounts. The photos I'd taken of him at the hotel, coupled with screenshots of their messages, were enough to raise serious red flags. The report was sent directly to the company's HR department. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. Within 48 hours, Rick was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. But that wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the weight of every choice he'd made. I used the anonymous tip line of a local news station to leak the story of a married marketing executive involved in an extramarital scandal and potential financial misconduct. I knew they'd bite. The media loves a juicy scandal, especially when it involves someone like Rick, who had spent his career cultivating an image of integrity. By the end of the week, his name and face were plastered across every local news outlet. His colleagues turned on him, and his wife, Danielle, filed for divorce. Rick had lost his job, his reputation, and the comfortable life he'd built on lies. While Rick's world was burning, Amanda was left to deal with the fallout on her end. I had frozen her access to all shared accounts and changed the locks on the house while she was away. When she tried to use her credit card, it was declined. That evening, she confronted me, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. "What the hell is going on, Jacob? Why can't I use my cards? Why is my key not working?" I looked her dead in the eye, my voice calm and measured. "You lost the privilege of sharing my home and my resources the moment you decided to share yourself with another man." Her face twisted in shock, but I didn't stop. "I know everything, Amanda. The hotel, the texts, the weekend at the lake house. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" For the first time in years, Amanda was speechless. She stammered, trying to piece together some excuse, but I cut her off. "Don't insult me by lying. Pack your things and get out." As Amanda scrambled to gather her belongings, I launched the final part of my plan. Using the evidence I had collected, I created a private online post detailing her affair. I sent the link to her friends, family, and colleagues. It wasn't vindictive, it was the truth, laid bare for everyone to see. The reactions were swift. Friends who once admired Amanda for her poise and charm turned their backs on her. Her family, blindsided by the revelation, reached out to me, offering apologies they didn't owe. Amanda tried to defend herself, claiming it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. No one believed her, and no one came to her defense. Amanda returned later that night, begging for a second chance. She sobbed, swearing she would end things with Rick and work to rebuild our marriage. But her tears fell on deaf ears. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice cold. "You betrayed the life we built together, the trust that took decades to earn. There's no coming back from this." As she left for the last time, I felt no guilt, no remorse. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Amanda was out of my house, but I wasn't done. She had walked out with the bare minimum, just a suitcase and the clothes on her back. Her desperate pleas for forgiveness had left no impression on me. Betrayal like hers didn't deserve understanding or sympathy. My plan wasn't just about getting her out of my life. It was about ensuring she couldn't rebuild what she had so carelessly destroyed. Rick, on the other hand, was in free fall. His company's investigation had taken a sharp turn after the anonymous report I'd sent. HR had discovered discrepancies in his expense accounts, and with his reputation already in tatters from the news story, they didn't hesitate to terminate him. The fallout had extended beyond his job. His wife, Danielle, had taken the photos and messages I'd provided and filed for divorce. She wasn't staying silent either, her lawyer was already building a case to take him for everything he had. The satisfaction I felt wasn't petty. It was justice. Rick had invaded my life, my home, and he had done it with the smug belief that he wouldn't face any consequences. But actions have consequences, and I was making sure he paid for every one of them. Amanda, of course, ran straight to him. She didn't have many options left. Her friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone exposed so publicly. Her family, embarrassed by the scandal, had turned their backs as well. Rick was all she had now, and I knew their relationship would crumble under the weight of their circumstances. I decided to accelerate the process. Through a contact I had in corporate investigations, I arranged to have Rick's finances thoroughly scrutinized. His accounts were a mess of hidden purchases and questionable transactions, many of which could easily be flagged as fraudulent. I didn't have to fabricate anything, his own carelessness was enough. The bank froze his accounts within days. With no job, no savings, and a divorce in progress, Rick was spiraling into financial ruin. Amanda's decision to latch onto him had been her final mistake. The man she'd risked everything for couldn't even support himself, let alone her. But I wasn't finished. One evening, I received a call from a mutual friend. He told me that Amanda and Rick had been spotted arguing at a bar. The scene was public, loud, and humiliating for both of them. Amanda accused him of ruining her life, while Rick fired back that she was the one who dragged him into the mess. The friend mentioned how Amanda stormed out, leaving Rick alone, visibly shaken. I smiled. It was exactly what I expected. They had built their relationship on lies and betrayal, and now those same foundations were tearing them apart. But I wanted one last confrontation. I reached out to Amanda and invited her to meet me at a neutral location. The message was simple: if you want closure, show up. Otherwise, don't ever contact me again. I knew she wouldn't resist. Despite everything, people like her always craved the chance to explain themselves, to play the victim one last time. When she arrived, she looked different, defeated, hollow, nothing like the confident woman who had once laughed in my face with Rick by her side. She tried to start with an apology, but I cut her off. This isn't about apologies, Amanda. It's about accountability. You destroyed everything we built together, and for what? A man who can't even pay his own bills? Her voice cracked as she tried to defend herself. I made a mistake, Jacob. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't let her finish. Mistakes don't happen over months of planning, Amanda. Mistakes don't involve hotel rooms, text messages, and secret getaways. You didn't make a mistake, you made a choice. She sat in silence, tears streaming down her face. But I didn't feel pity. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I leaned forward, my tone cold and unyielding. You need to understand something. You didn't just lose me. You lost the life I gave you, the respect of everyone who once cared about you, and any chance of rebuilding what you threw away. There's no forgiveness here, Amanda. You chose chaos over stability, and now you have to live with the consequences. I stood up, leaving her there alone. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't for show. It was the final chapter of her story in my life. As I drove away, I felt no regret. For the first time in months, I felt free. Rick and Amanda's collapse was everything I had hoped for, but I wasn't done. They had made choices that destroyed lives, mine, Danielle's, and even their own. They didn't just betray trust, they spat on the foundation of decency and respect. I had no intention of letting them move forward without feeling the weight of what they'd done. Amanda was trying hard to piece her life back together. She attended social events, hoping to reconnect with people she had alienated. She forced smiles, exaggerated laughter, and acted as though she wasn't the subject of whispers and judgment. But those efforts were futile. Her name was synonymous with scandal, and her attempts at redemption rang hollow. Rick's world had gone silent. His job was gone, his wife had left him, and his finances were frozen in the middle of his divorce proceedings. He wasn't the smug, confident man I had encountered months ago. Now he was just another man on the brink, scrambling to stay afloat. But I had more planned for both of them. One evening, I received a tip from a mutual acquaintance that Amanda was trying to land a position at a local nonprofit. She must have believed working for a noble cause would distract people from her tarnished reputation. She was wrong. I spent the night drafting an email to the nonprofit's leadership. I laid out the facts, attaching photos of Amanda with Rick, screenshots of their messages, and a brief summary of their actions. The tone was professional, not emotional, and I concluded with a simple question: is this the kind of person you want representing your mission? It didn't take long for them to respond. Amanda's application was rejected, and word spread quickly through the nonprofit community. Her name became even more toxic, ensuring no similar opportunities would come her way. Rick was still fighting for a foothold in his industry. He had been reaching out to old colleagues, hoping to find work, but I had made sure his name was untouchable. Using anonymous tips and the evidence I had gathered, I contacted influential figures in his field, detailing his affair and the financial misconduct that had cost him his job. Within weeks, Rick was unemployable. His contacts stopped answering his calls, his emails were ignored, and his reputation was beyond repair. I decided it was time to bring them together, to force them to face their choices not just individually but as partners in destruction. I used a burner phone to send Amanda and Rick identical messages, claiming to be a neutral party willing to help mediate and find a way forward. The messages were vague enough to intrigue them without raising suspicion. They both agreed to the meeting, which I arranged at a neutral location, a small office space I had rented. When they arrived, I was already seated at the head of the table. Amanda hesitated in the doorway when she saw me, her face turning pale. Rick followed, his posture stiff and uneasy. "Sit down," I said firmly. They exchanged glances but complied, taking seats across from me. "I didn't bring you here to argue," I began, my voice steady. "I brought you here to show you exactly what you've done, not just to me, but to yourselves." I placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward them. "Inside is everything," I continued. "Every text, every photo, every receipt, every consequence. This is the story you wrote together." Rick opened the folder first. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. Amanda leaned in, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she realized the depth of what I had compiled. "You thought you could destroy my life and walk away without consequences," I said, my tone unrelenting. "But that's not how the world works. Every choice you made led you here." Rick tried to respond, his voice faltering. "Jacob, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean what?" I interrupted sharply. "You didn't mean to lie? To cheat? To humiliate and destroy people's lives? Spare me your excuses, Rick. You knew exactly what you were doing." Amanda finally spoke, though her voice was barely audible. "Jacob, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't think." "Mistakes happen once, Amanda," I said coldly. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a series of decisions. Over and over again, you chose betrayal. You chose to destroy everything we built together. And now, you're paying for it." The silence in the room was heavy. Amanda stared at the table, her tears falling freely. Rick sat frozen, his pride and arrogance shattered. I stood, leaving the folder on the table. "Take a good look at what you've done," I said. "This is your legacy now. You wrote it. Live with it." I turned and walked out, not looking back. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about their suffering, it was about knowing that justice had been served. For the first time in months, I felt free. I wasn't naive enough to think that a single confrontation would be the end of it. Rick and Amanda's expressions during our last meeting told me everything I needed to know. They were broken but defiant, clinging to whatever shreds of pride they had left. That wasn't good enough. They hadn't just wronged me, they had shown no remorse for the lives they'd disrupted. My plan wasn't just to expose their betrayal. It was to ensure they had nowhere left to hide. The aftermath of our meeting spread quickly. Amanda had become a social outcast, her name whispered in judgment wherever she went. Rick was faring no better, his professional life permanently destroyed. But I knew desperation could make people reckless. I needed one final move to seal their fate. One evening, I got a call from Danielle, Rick's ex-wife. We hadn't spoken in weeks, but she sounded different, calmer, more resolved. "I've been hearing things," she began, her voice steady but cold. "About Amanda trying to reach out to her old circle, and Rick, well, he's stirring up trouble." I wasn't surprised. Rick had always been arrogant, and even now, stripped of everything, he would try to fight back. Amanda, on the other hand, was predictable. She didn't know how to operate outside the bubble of comfort I had built for her. "I think it's time we finish this," Danielle said, her words filled with quiet determination. Her suggestion intrigued me. Together, we came up with a plan to deliver a final blow that would ensure Rick and Amanda's downfall was absolute. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Amanda had convinced a mutual friend to host a small gathering, an attempt to reintroduce herself to the world as if nothing had happened. Rick was invited as well, his last desperate attempt to stay relevant in a circle that no longer wanted him. Danielle and I worked in tandem. She secured an invitation to the gathering, ensuring she'd be there to witness the fallout. I prepared the evidence, every shred of proof I had collected over the months. But this time, I wasn't keeping it quiet. The night of the event, I sent a series of anonymous messages to key attendees, attaching photos of Amanda and Rick together, screenshots of their messages, and even details of Rick's financial misconduct. The subject line was simple: the truth about Amanda and Rick. As people began to arrive at the gathering, their phones buzzed with the notifications. Whispers turned into murmurs, then into audible gasps. Amanda's forced smile faltered as she noticed the shifting atmosphere. Rick, always attuned to his ego, realized something was wrong but couldn't pinpoint what. By the time Danielle walked in, the room was buzzing with tension. She didn't wait for Amanda or Rick to approach her. Instead, she walked straight to the center of the gathering and addressed the group. "I think it's time we stop pretending," Danielle said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Everyone here knows what Amanda and Rick did. So let's get it all out in the open." The room fell silent. Amanda's face went pale, her hands trembling as she looked around. Rick tried to speak, but Danielle wasn't done. "Rick destroyed our marriage," she continued, her voice steady. "He lied, cheated, and thought he could walk away without consequences. Amanda helped him, knowing exactly what she was doing. I stayed outside, watching from my car as the scene unfolded. I didn't need to be inside to know what was happening. I could imagine the panic on their faces, the way the crowd would turn against them." Danielle called me later that night, her voice filled with a mix of relief and triumph. "They left in a hurry," she said, laughing bitterly. Amanda was crying. Rick tried to save face, but no one was buying it. I smiled to myself. It was exactly what I had envisioned. The gathering was supposed to be their chance at redemption, but instead, it became their final humiliation. The next day, I made one final move. I sent the evidence I had to every organization Amanda had reached out to, ensuring she couldn't escape her tarnished reputation. Rick wasn't spared either. Every detail of his misconduct found its way to his former industry contacts, making sure his name remained toxic. They had spent months building a relationship on lies and betrayal, and now they had nothing left. Their reputations, their connections, and their dignity were gone. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because they needed to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. Actions have consequences, and betrayal comes with a cost. As I sat at my desk that evening, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't triumph or victory, it was closure. The weight of their betrayal had been lifted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Rick and Amanda's downfall was almost complete, but I knew better than to leave anything to chance. They had proven time and again that they were willing to lie, manipulate, and claw their way back if it meant salvaging a shred of their dignity. I couldn't let that happen. Their choices had consequences, and I was determined to see them through to the very end. Amanda's social world was shrinking. She had burned so many bridges that only a handful of people still spoke to her, and even they were starting to waver. Rick, meanwhile, had become a ghost. His desperation was palpable: missed rent payments, ignored job applications, and increasingly erratic behavior. They were both on the edge, and I was ready to give them the final push. Amanda's family was my first target. They were the only ones still giving her the benefit of the doubt, clinging to the idea that she was just going through a rough patch. That illusion needed to end. I spent hours compiling a package of evidence tailored specifically for her relatives. It included photos of Amanda with Rick, text messages detailing their affair, and bank statements showing how she had siphoned money from our accounts to fund her deceit. Each package was sent anonymously with a single note: "This is the truth about Amanda. Decide for yourselves." The fallout was swift. By the next day, Amanda's phone was flooded with angry messages from her siblings and parents. They accused her of lying, of humiliating the family, and of dragging them into her mess. Even the few relatives who had been sympathetic turned their backs, leaving her completely isolated. Rick wasn't spared. His eviction notice had already forced him to scramble for a new place to stay, but I wasn't done. Through public records, I found out he had a pending application for a new rental property. Using the same anonymous approach, I sent the landlord evidence of Rick's financial instability and his history of legal troubles stemming from his divorce. The application was denied within days, leaving him with nowhere to go. At the same time, I leaked details of his financial misconduct to a local industry newsletter. The story spread quickly, further solidifying his reputation as untrustworthy and unemployable. Rick had nowhere to hide, and his options were dwindling. But I wasn't satisfied with isolating them individually. I wanted them to face their ruin together. Using a burner phone, I sent Rick a message pretending to be someone offering him a lucrative freelance opportunity. The message was designed to lure him into showing up at a specific location, a public park near Amanda's favorite coffee shop. At the same time, I messaged Amanda, posing as a potential ally willing to help her repair her relationships. When they arrived, I stayed hidden at a distance, watching as they spotted each other. Amanda's face twisted in anger the moment she saw Rick, and he didn't look any happier. Their argument started quietly, but it quickly escalated. Amanda accused Rick of ruining her life, of dragging her down with him. Rick fired back, calling her a manipulative liar who had used him as much as she had betrayed me. Their voices grew louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. Phones came out, cameras recording the spectacle of two people tearing each other apart in broad daylight. I stayed back, documenting the scene myself, knowing that their public meltdown would be the final nail in the coffin of their reputations. That night, I received a call from Danielle. "Did you see the videos?" she asked, laughing. "They are all over social media. Amanda and Rick are trending." I had already seen them. The footage of their argument had gone viral, with countless comments mocking their downfall. Strangers online were piecing together the story, using the leaked evidence in their own imaginations to paint a vivid picture of betrayal and collapse. "They're done," Danielle said, her tone satisfied. "No one's going to take them seriously after this." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "It's what they deserve." Later that night, I sat alone in my house, reflecting on everything that had happened. The months of planning, the endless nights of gathering evidence, the emotional toll of watching everything unfold, it was finally over. Amanda and Rick had no one left to turn to. Their reputations were destroyed, their lives in shambles. For the first time, I felt the weight lift. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I didn't feel joy or triumph, only peace. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Rick and Amanda's lives were falling apart, but I knew it wasn't enough. The pain they caused wasn't something that could be swept under the rug or forgotten over time. Their betrayal wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate choice, and I had no intention of letting them recover. They needed to face the weight of what they'd done, with no path forward to escape it. After their public fight in the park went viral, Amanda's social world all but disappeared. The whispers behind her back had grown into outright condemnation, and even her most loyal friends had begun to drift away. Rick, meanwhile, had become invisible. He was moving from one couch to another, trying to survive in a world where he had burned every bridge. But I knew their humiliation wasn't enough. People like them always tried to claw their way back, twisting stories to make themselves look like victims. I wasn't going to let that happen. Amanda's charity event was her final attempt at redemption. She had poured everything into promoting it online, framing it as an effort to give back to the community. The posts were filled with smiling photos and emotional captions, but anyone who knew her story could see the cracks. I began by contacting the hospital Amanda had partnered with for the event. My message was professional, but direct. I outlined her history of lies and financial deception, attaching records that showed how she had funneled money from our joint accounts to fund her affair. I included screenshots of messages between her and Rick that revealed her true motivations. The hospital acted quickly. They released a public statement withdrawing their support, clarifying that they had no connection to Amanda or her event. Without the hospital's endorsement, donors started pulling out, leaving Amanda scrambling to salvage what little she could. To ensure her failure was public, I reached out to a journalist who specialized in community scandals. I provided a detailed timeline of Amanda's actions, framing her event as a cynical ploy to repair her shattered image. The article went live 2 days before the event and spread like wildfire. When the day arrived, the grand venue Amanda had booked was eerily empty. The tables were set, the decorations carefully arranged, but the guests never came. Amanda stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by silence and her own failure. Rick's collapse was just as thorough. After being evicted, he had applied for a small, run-down apartment in the outskirts of town. It was his last chance to find a stable place to live. Through public records, I found out about the application and reached out to the landlord anonymously. I provided documentation of Rick's eviction history, financial instability, and ongoing legal troubles. I painted a clear picture of the risk Rick posed as a tenant, and the landlord promptly denied his application. Without a permanent address, Rick was forced to rely on the few people who still answered his calls. But his reputation had preceded him, and even his most desperate acquaintances began turning him away. The final stage of my plan was the most public. Over months, I had compiled a detailed exposé, a video that told the entire story of Rick and Amanda's betrayal. It wasn't sensationalized, it was factual and devastating. The video included photos of their affair, screenshots of their messages, and testimony from people they had hurt. It even featured footage from their viral fight in the park, serving as a vivid example of their unraveling. I titled it The True Cost of Betrayal and uploaded it anonymously to several platforms. Within hours, the video began to gain traction. The views climbed steadily as people shared it across social media, each comment more damning than the last. Strangers dissected every detail, piecing together the timeline and speculating about the fallout. Amanda and Rick became household names, not for their accomplishments, but for their failures. By the next day, Amanda had deleted all her social media accounts. Rick disappeared entirely, too ashamed to face the world. They had become pariahs, their reputations obliterated and their lives reduced to rubble. That evening, Danielle called me. "It's over," she said simply. "They've lost everything. Amanda's family won't even speak to her, and Rick, no one's seen him in days." I leaned back, letting her words settle. "Good," I replied. "That's what they deserve." Danielle hesitated for a moment. "Do you feel better now?" I thought about it. The months of planning, the sleepless nights, the weight of their betrayal, it had all led to this moment. "I feel done," I said finally. They made their choices, and now they have to live with them. Later that night, I sat outside, watching the quiet street. For the first time in months, the weight on my shoulders felt lighter. This wasn't about winning or revenge, it was about justice, about making sure they couldn't do to someone else what they had done to me. As I watched the stars appear one by one, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a peace.